Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we will study the thalamus. First we see the learning objectives. First one is to list the different parts of the thalamus. Next, list the boundaries of the thalamus. List the thalamic nuclei and their primary functions and connections, and describe the blood supply to the thalamus. First, introduction of the thalamus. Anatomically, if we see, this is a midline symmetrical gray matter which has two halves, right and left, and it is situated between the cerebral cortex and the midbrain. Here cerebral cortex, and this is midbrain, and this is thalamus. The term thalamus derives from the Greek word which means inner chamber or meeting place. It is the largest division of the diencephalon. You have already studied the division of brain. The primary division, proencephalon, has two subdivisions, telencephalon and diencephalon. And from diencephalon, this thalamus arises. It has a rostrocaudal dimension in humans of about 30 millimeter. Its height is 20 millimeter, and width of about 20 millimeter, and it has estimated that it contains 10 million neurons in each hemisphere. The thalamus receives precortical input from all sensory systems except the olfactory system, and it receives largest input from the cerebral cortex. Functionally, we see that the thalamus is an important relay and integrative station for information passing to all areas of the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia. These are the gray matters in the cerebral cortex, then hypothalamus and brain stem. Now we see the general appearance of the thalamus. It is a large egg-shaped mass of gray matter that form the major part of the diencephalon. This is thalamus, and there are two thalami, one situated in each side of the third ventricle. This is third ventricle. The anterior end of the thalamus is narrow and rounded and forms the posterior boundary of the interventricular foramen. Here is the interventricular foramen. If we see the posterior boundary or posterior end of the thalamus, it is expanded and it is called pulvinar, which overhangs the superior colliculus. This is superior colliculus. The inferior surface is continuous with the tegmentum of the midbrain. And if you see the medial surface of the thalamus, it forms part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and it usually united to the opposite thalamus by a band of gray matter, the interthalamic connection or interthalamic adhesion. Now we see the boundaries of the thalamus. Anteriorly, interventricular foramen; posteriorly, free pole of the pulvinar; dorsal, free surface of the underlying fornix; and lateral ventricle; ventrally, plane connecting the hypothalamic sulci. Medially, we see the third ventricle, and laterally the limb of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. This picture also shows the boundaries of the thalami. Now we see the subdivisions of the thalamus. Like other parts of the brain, it has also gray matter and white matter. The thalamus is covered on its superior surface by a thin layer of white matter called stratum zonale. And on the lateral surface by another layer, external medullary lamina. This is external medullary lamina, and this is the lateral surface, this is medial surface, and this is interthalamic adhesion. And here on the superior surface is the stratum zonale. The gray matter of the thalamus is divided by a vertical sheath. This is a vertical sheath which divides the gray matter into different parts, and this is called internal medullary lamina. And main two halves, medial and lateral half. This is medial half and this is the lateral half. This is Y-shape internal medullary lamina. Internal medullary lamina, here in this picture we can also see easily. It consists of nerve fibers that pass from one thalamic nucleus to another. Anterosuperiorly, the internal medullary lamina splits into Y-shape. Three main parts. The anterior part lies between the limbs. This is anterior part. And the medial and lateral part, this is medial part and this is lateral part, which lies on the sides of the stem of the Y. Now we see the anterior part. This is anterior part of the thalamus, which contains the anterior thalamic nuclei. They receive mammillothalamic tract from the mammillary nuclei. These anterior thalamic nuclei also receive reciprocal connections with the cingulate gyrus and hypothalamus. So fibers go from the thalamus to these two structures and come from the two structures, cingulate gyrus and the hypothalamus. The function of the anterior thalamic nuclei is related with that of the limbic system and is concerned with emotional tone and recent memory. Now we see the medial part. The medial part of the thalamus contains a large dorsomedial nucleus. This is dorsomedial nucleus, the spincle, and several smaller nuclei. It is reciprocally connected to the prefrontal cortex, and it has abundant connection with the intralaminar nuclei. This is lamina, and this also contains different nuclei. It has similar connections with the hypothalamic nuclei. It receives input from amygdala or amygdaloid body, temporal neocortex, and substantia nigra. When this is destroyed, it results in memory loss, which is called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. It plays a role in the expression of affect, emotion, and behavior. That is the limbic function. Now see the lateral part. If you see the lateral part, it is further subdivided into dorsal tire and the ventral tire. This is dorsal tire, this is ventral. The dorsal tire includes the lateral dorsal nucleus. This is lateral dorsal nucleus. And the lateral posterior nucleus. This another part, lateral posterior nucleus. And the third one is the pulvinar. So these three parts are from the dorsal tire of the nuclei. They are known to have interconnections with other thalamic nuclei and with parietal of the cerebral hemisphere, cingulate gyrus, and occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. Now we see the ventral tie nuclei. This is ventral tie nuclei. It contains ventral anterior nucleus. This is ventral anterior, this black color ventral anterior nucleus. This nucleus is connected to the reticular formation, substantia nigra, and the corpus striatum, and the premotor cortex. This is premotor cortex. This is motor cortex. This is central sulcus, as well as to many other thalamic nuclei. And if we see the function of this nucleus, it probably influences the activities of the motor cortex. Now we see the ventral lateral nucleus. This is yellow color, ventral lateral nucleus of the thalamus. This nucleus has connections similar to those of the ventral anterior nucleus, but in addition it has major input from the cerebellum. It has major input from the cerebellum and a minor input from the red nucleus. Its main projections pass to the motor and premotor regions of the cerebral cortex. This is motor region, this is premotor. And this thalamic nucleus also probably influences motor activity. Then ventral posterior nucleus. It is further subdivided into two parts: ventral posteromedial nucleus VPM and ventral posterolateral nucleus VPL. The ventral posteromedial or VPM nucleus receives the ascending trigeminal and gustatory pathways, while the ventral posterolateral nucleus receives important ascending sensory tracts and medial lemniscus and the spinal lemniscus. The thalamocortical projections from these important nuclei pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, then through corona radiata, and ultimately they reach the primary somatic sensory area of the cerebral cortex, which lies in the post-central gyrus, area 312. This picture shows the main connections of the thalamus. Afferent fibers on the left side, and these are the efferent fibers on the right side. This is another enlarged picture which shows important thalamocortical projections. Now there are other nuclei of the thalamus. These nuclei include intralaminar nuclei, midline nuclei, reticular nucleus, and medial geniculate body and lateral geniculate body. First we see the intralaminar nuclei. These are small collections of the nerve cells within the internal medullary lamina. And these nuclei receive efferent fibers from reticular formation as well as from fibers from the spinothalamic tract and trigeminothalamic tract. And they send efferent fibers to the other thalamic nuclei, which in turn project to the cerebral cortex. And these intralaminar nuclei also send fibers to the corpus striatum. And these intralaminar nuclei are believed to influence the level of consciousness and alertness in an individual. Here, internal medullary lamina, and this contains interlaminar nuclei. Now, midline nuclei, here on the medial side. The midline nuclei consist of a group of nerve cells adjacent to the third ventricle. This area below is adjacent to the third ventricle, and in the interthalamic connection, this is interthalamic adhesion. They receive efferent fibers from the reticular formation, and their function is unknown. Next, reticular nucleus. It is a thin layer of nerve cells sandwiched between external medullary lamina and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. We can see this picture. Here, reticular nucleus between external medullary lamina and the internal capsule. Afferent fibers converge on the nucleus from cerebral cortex and reticular formation, and its output is mainly to other thalamic nuclei. Function of reticular nucleus may be concerned with mechanism by which cerebral cortex regulates the thalamic activity. Next, the medial geniculate body. It forms part of the auditory pathway, and these are swellings on the posterior surface of the thalamus beneath the pulvinar. Here we can see this is medial geniculate body, this is lateral geniculate body beneath the pulvinar. The afferent fibers to the medial geniculate body form the inferior brachium and comes from the inferior colliculus. These structures you will have been studying in the midbrain. Inferior colliculus receives termination fibers of the lateral lemniscus. So if you see the medial geniculate body, it receives auditory information from both ears, but predominantly from the opposite ear. The efferent fibers leave the medial geniculate body to form auditory radiation, which passes to the auditory cortex, area 41-42 of the superior temporal gyrus. Medial geniculate body's radiation. And now we come to the lateral geniculate body. It forms part of the visual pathway and is a swelling on the undersurface of the pulvinar of the thalamus. It is a visual relay nucleus. It receives a retinal input via the optic tract, and it projects to the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe. Area 17, the lingual gyrus and the cuneus. And these projections are via optic radiation. Now we see the blood supply of the thalamus. It has posterior communicating artery, which gives rise to anterior thalamo-perforating arteries. This is posterior communicating artery, and this gives this branch. Anterior thalamo-perforating. Posterior cerebral artery. This is posterior cerebral artery. This gives rise to posterior choroidal arteries. It also gives rise to posterior thalamo-perforating arteries. These are perforating arteries. These are posterior choroidal arteries. These are branches of the posterior cerebral artery. And anterior choroidal arteries. This is anterior choroidal arteries. Now we see the lesion of the thalamus. First one is the sensory loss. These lesions usually result from thrombosis or hemorrhage of one of the arteries supplying the thalamus. Damage to the ventral posteromedial nucleus and the ventral posterolateral nucleus, VPM and VPL, will result in the loss of all forms of sensation, including light touch, tactile localization, and discrimination, and muscle joint sense from the opposite side of the body. Next is the thalamic pain. The thalamic pain may occur as the patient is recovering from a thalamic infarct. It is a spontaneous pain which is often excessive and occurs on the opposite side of the body. The painful sensation may be aroused by light touch or by cold and may fail to respond to powerful analgesic drugs. So, analgesia cannot relieve the pain. Next we come to abnormal involuntary movements. This is chorioathetosis with ataxia and may follow vascular lesion of the thalamus. It is not certain whether these signs in all cases are due to the loss of function of thalamus or to the involvement of the neighboring caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. These are the corpus striatum, part of the corpus striatum. The ataxia may arise as a result of loss of appreciation of muscle and joint movement caused by thalamic lesion. Next is the thalamic hand. The contralateral hand is held in an abnormal posture in some patients with thalamic lesions. Wrist is pronated and flexed, and the metacarpophalangeal joints are flexed. These are metacarpophalangeal joints, and the interphalangeal joints are extended. The fingers can be moved actively, but the movements are slow. And this condition is due to altered muscle tone in the different muscle groups. Thank you.